Hey folks, I thought we'd pick up in Romans chapter 2. We talked about chapter 1 last week, where Paul is in essence indicting the Gentile world in sin. And in chapter 2 now, he will indict the Jewish world in sin. Paul wanted to go and take the gospel over into Spain. And it's very clear that in Rome, there was some division in the church there, and Paul is trying to unite the church together. And in so doing, he writes this very lengthy book, and he talks a lot about what is dividing the Jew and the Gentile. He is, of course, an apostle to the Gentiles and trying to bring the church there together. And so one of the interesting things, and we talked about this last week, is that where he's going is to talk about justification by faith in Jesus Christ. He's wanting to talk about the gospel, the good news of the gospel. You know, when you go into a jeweler to look at diamonds, one of the things that they'll do is they'll bring out a black piece of cloth, the blackest that they can find, to put out the diamonds on. Well, why do they do that? Because the diamonds sparkle their best. They show their brilliance up against that backdrop of black. I think that's kind of what Paul is doing here. Is again, he's going to talk about the gospel, but before he talks about the gospel, he's going to talk about their sin and the blackness, if you will, of their sin, so that it magnifies the gospel. John Wesley was once asked, "What is the secret to your evangelistic efforts?" And what he said was that the first 10 days or so, when he went into a town or a village, he would just speak about the law. And he would talk about that for a good period of time before he started turning to talk about the gospel. And in essence, that is what Paul is doing here in the book of Romans. He will focus on the law in chapters 1 through 3, and then, which is what's kind of a gloomy, glum, black, picture. But he'll get to the gospel in chapter 4. But we'll just have to make our way through the bad news before we get to the good news in chapter 4. In Romans chapter 2, again, he focuses in on the Jew. Now, think about yourself as a Jew. The Jews thought, we're the people of God. We have the law of God. They had a lot of pride in the fact that they were the people of God, the chosen people of God. I like to say, though, for those who think, well, God chose the Jews, there's a very real sense in which God did not choose the Jews. God made the Jews. Abraham and Sarai, they couldn't bear children. The fact of the matter is, God is the one who enabled them to have children. In essence, God created Israel, if you will, out of nothing, from barrenness. So, yes, I know there's a sense in which he did, choose Israel to be the one through whom the Messiah would come. But there's also a very real sense in that Jesus, God actually made the nation of Israel. So they took a lot of pride in that. They took a lot of pride in the fact that they had the law. That was their boast. And so they felt or believed themselves to be favored by God over the Gentiles. And so you can imagine, as Paul is writing the book of Romans in chapter 1, that they're on the sideline saying, "Preach on, Brother Paul. You're doing a great job." But now their seat starts to get a little uncomfortable, because in chapter 2, he will turn and focus in on the Jews. And in chapter 2, he says in verse 1, "Therefore you are inexcusable, O man, whoever you are who judge, for in whatever you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same things." Now, he's talking to the Jews here. We know that because in chapter 2, in verse 17, he will say, "Indeed, you are called a Jew." So he's focused his attention, he switched his attention from the Gentiles in chapter 1 to talk about the Jews. The problem with the Jew, though, is that they were hypocritical. They were judging the Gentiles, and yet they themselves were guilty of the same sins. You know, I've heard you have heard it before. Be careful who you point your finger at, because there's 3 fingers at least that are pointing right back at you. And so that's essentially what he's saying here. Same thing is said in Matthew chapter 7 in verses 1 and following. I think a lot of people misunderstand those passages. We see in the fact that in chapter 1, Paul has indeed judged the Gentiles to be in sin. I mean, the Bible makes it very clear just to be very careful about that practice, because in essence you condemn yourself in judging other people. Standards that apply to you that you're judging other people by. And so you have to be very careful about that kind of thing. And the Jews were in fact guilty of this. And that's what he's saying here, is the fact that you're a Jew, but you're really no different than the Gentiles, because you practice the very same things that you are condemning them for. In verse 2 he says, "But we know the judgment of God is according to truth against those who practice such things." So one of the standards by which God does judge people is truth. Verse 3, "And do you think this, O man, you who judge those practicing such things and doing the same, that you will escape the judgment of God?" In other words, do you think just because you're a Jew, just because you're a descendant of Abraham, that you're going to be able to escape the judgment of God when you're practicing the very same thing that the Gentiles practice? It's obviously the answer to that question is no, they are not. Or do you despise the riches of his goodness, forbearance, and long-suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leads you to repentance? One of the things we definitely see in the Old Testament, and particularly in God's dealing with the Jews and the children of Israel, is that he was long-suffering, very patient. I like to say he was long-suffering, and just exaggerate that for purpose here, because he definitely did exercise so much patience, hundreds of years in dealing with the children of Israel, and trying to bring them to repentance and come to know him as the true and living God. But it says in verse 5, "But in accordance with your hardness and your impenitent heart, you are treasuring up for yourselves wrath in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to each one according to his deeds." This becomes an important topic here, because basically what Paul is going to say is that there is no respecter of persons with God. He is going to render to each person, whether they be Jew or Gentile, according to their deeds and what they have done. Eternal life to those who by patient continuance in doing good seek for glory, honor, immortality. But to those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, indignation, and wrath, tribulation, and anguish on every soul who does evil, of the Jew first, and also the Greek. But glory, honor, and peace to everyone who works what is good, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek, for there is no partiality with God. And so, in essence, what he's saying here is there is no respecter of persons with God. He's fair in his treatment and in his judgment with the Jews and also to the Greeks. You'll see this statement time and again in where Paul will say to the Jew first and also to the Greek. The fact of the matter is, when we open up the book of Acts, the gospel was preached to the Jew first. The Jews rejected Christ, and then the gospel then went to the Gentiles. If you stop and think about it, there should have been no more prepared people for the gospel of Jesus Christ than the Jews. Paul notes that, and we see in the scriptures that God chose Israel. They were given a covenant in Exodus chapter 20 that was ratified in Exodus chapter 24. They got to know God in a very special way, and God revealed himself to them in a very special way. I kind of like to think of the Old Covenant as kind of like a spiritual set of training wheels that you might put on a bicycle. You're preparing somebody to ride the bike. So that's what Paul is saying here, is that, you know, they were favored by God. They had got to know God in a very special way. They should have been more prepared than anyone else to receive the Christ and that news when the gospel was spread, and or when they first had the first gospel sermon, if you will, noting Jesus' resurrection from the dead. By the way, today's Easter. Happy Easter. Thinking about Jesus' resurrection from the dead. That was announced in Acts chapter 2 and declared that he had been risen from the dead, was seated at the right hand of God. They should have been more prepared for that message than anyone else. But the fact of the matter is that in general, they were not. And they rejected the Christ. And so the gospel went to the Gentiles. So that's what he's saying here was, you know, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. There's also a very real sense, and we see this in the scriptures, the idea that to whom much is given, much is required. So that's also something that the gospel was, the law of God was given to the Jews, and so they were in a very favored position, and in that sense they were, you know, very much responsible. For as many as have sinned without the law will also perish without law. As many as have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified. And one of the things we see here in the book of Romans is that, you know, the Gentiles, of course, did not have the law, that is, the law of Moses. The Jews did have the law of Moses. That doesn't mean that there wasn't any law prior to the law of Moses. In fact, when we turn over to the book of Genesis, we see there are any number of things that were considered wrong or sinful prior to the law of Moses being given. The fact of the matter is, we see that murder was wrong, among many other sins that are mentioned. Covetousness is mentioned, and we see that in the book of Genesis, and several other things. You know, we could go on and on about that. So prior to the law of Moses, there was law, and man was held accountable to that law. So he says here, as many as have sinned without law, that is the law of Moses, will also perish without the law. And as many as have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. So as many as sinned in the law of Moses, there were like 613 commandments in the old law. As many as those 613 commandments that were violated, that the Jew was under, then they'll be judged by the law. And the point that Paul is trying to make here is it doesn't matter that you have the law. It doesn't matter that you're circumcised. It doesn't matter that you're a child of Abraham. What really matters is that you do the law. There was a guy, and it was kind of an interesting story I heard, who told a Scottish minister, he says, I'm going over to the Holy Lands and I'm going to climb Mount Sinai. And when I climb the top of Mount Sinai, I'm going to get up there and I'm going to shout the 10 Commandments at the top of my lungs. And the minister looked at him and said, well, it's really more important that you just go ahead and stay here and do them rather than to go over there and shout them at the top of your lungs. That's what Paul's saying here. It's not the fact that you're like in some holy place, Mount Sinai, or you have the law or whatever. What really matters is that you do the law. And he'll go on to talk about the fact that the Gentiles knew something of God. They knew something of morality. We talked about this in chapter 1. That there was very much a sense of morality in the hearts of the Gentiles. And they knew and they practiced the things, many of them did anyway, that were good. And there were, good Gentiles, if you will, who practiced those elements that actually can be found in the law, even though they didn't have the law of Moses. And so that's what he'll say here in verse 14, for when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, that is the law of Moses, are law unto themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts. There was a law that was written in their hearts that many of the Gentiles practiced those things. And he says that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness between themselves, their thoughts accusing or else excusing them in the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. And so we see here again the standard that God will judge really both the Gentiles and the Jews by, and that is the truth. There's a truth that many of the Gentiles knew in their hearts, and to the extent that they kept that, that was great. To the extent that they went against that truth, then they were in sin. But the Jews had the law of Moses. Again, 613 commandments in the law of Moses, and they didn't keep that. And yet they are, in essence, judging the Gentiles who didn't have the law. And so they're in no better position, if you will, than the Gentiles. That's what he's driving at here in Romans chapter 2. In fact, in verse 17, we see, indeed, you who are called a Jew and rest on the law. Now, when you see that word rest on the law, think of somebody who places their confidence in, rather than placing their confidence on the fact that that they were keeping the law and trying to practice the law and trying to change their hearts. They had a misplaced confidence. Their confidence was in the fact that they were a child of Abraham, or the fact that they were called a Jew, or the fact that they had the law. They rest on the law. They rest on the fact that they have the law. We're the privileged because God has given us this law. You make your boast in God and know His will and approve the things that are excellent, being instructed out of the law, and are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, instructors of the foolish, teacher of the babes, having the form of knowledge and the truth in the law. So here he's setting them up. He says in verse 21, you therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that a man should not steal, do you steal? You who say do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who make your boast in the law, again, it's the Jew boasting about the fact that they have the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as it is written. So here we see the hypocrisy of the Jews. The fact that they had the law of Moses, they prided themselves on being the children of Israel, and yet they didn't keep the elements of the law themselves. And because of that, the name of God was blasphemed among the Gentiles. Again, to whom much is given, much is required. And they were in really no position to judge the Gentiles because they themselves were not keeping the very law that they made their boast in. Somebody might say here, Paul's meddling. He went from preaching to meddling now with the Jews. Well, there's probably some truth in that, but he's driving his point home that the reality of it is that they're in no better position than the Gentiles. Well, another element of being a Jew that they could take pride in was the fact, that certain things that set them aside. They had their dietary restrictions. They had the temple. Another thing that they had was circumcision. In verse 25, he says, "For circumcision is indeed profitable if you keep the law. But if you're a breaker of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision." The fact that circumcision was a sign of the covenant with God, but it should have been a sign of, instead of cutting off of the flesh, it should have been a sign of the fact that you're cutting off the sins that are in your heart. Circumcision, in a very real sense, was an outward sign of something that should have been inward in terms of a circumcision, of cutting off the sin that was in their hearts. And what he's saying here is the fact that if all you have is the sign of the covenant, then that really isn't doing you any good if you're not practicing the covenant. That circumcision is profitable only if you are keeping the covenant of God. Otherwise, it's like you're uncircumcised, because again, it should have indicated the fact that they had cut off from themselves, the sins from the world. So in essence, by disobeying the law, really, circumcision really didn't benefit them at all. Verse 26, he says, "Therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the righteous requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision?" That's an ouch to the Jew. Here is an uncircumcised man who is keeping the elements of the law. So in essence, that's the very thing that for a Jew, that their outward circumcision, physical circumcision, should have pointed to, of the being circumcised in your heart. Well, in essence, here's a Gentile who's circumcised in their heart. And so what he's saying here is the fact that in essence is kind of, counted as circumcision for the Gentile. Again, showing the hypocrisy and the inconsistency with the Jew between what they taught and what they practiced. In verse 27, he says, "And will not the physically uncircumcised, if he fulfills the law, judge you, even with your written code and circumcision, are a transgressor of the law?" There's a very real sense in which the Gentiles who kept the elements of the law were morally upright would judge the Jew who was circumcised and did not keep the law. Verse 28, "For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. But he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from God." Who is the real Jew? Who is the one who is really, if you will, circumcised? It's the one who's circumcised in their heart, that they cut off the sins of the world, and they love the Lord, and they seek the praise of God and not men. So in essence, what he's done here in chapter 2 is he's condemned the Jew by showing that they themselves are inconsistent in terms of their practice. He's showing that really the circumcision and all these benefits that they had and all the signs really were meaningless if they weren't turned to the Lord. So in the grand scheme of things, when you get through chapters 1 and 2, the Gentiles and the Jews were in the very same place. They both were in need of the gospel of Jesus Christ. They both were in need of being saved from their sin. Despite the fact that there were all the privileges that a Jew had, when it came down to it in the end, they were in the same state as the Gentile. Now, he'll talk about this later on in the book of Romans. We've got a long way to go in getting through this book. we'll even see some of the Jews' arguments, the fact they had all these 613 commandments, that they even would make the argument, well, in the end, if we sin more, isn't that a good thing because it shows more of the grace of God? Well, that seems silly to you and I, obviously, but that was one of the, claims that they would make, is the ends justify the means. That if we sin more, well, that just magnifies the grace of God. And so Paul will deal with some of those, some of the claims that the Jews would make, and make his own counterclaims later in the book of Romans. In chapter 3, we'll pick up there next week. Obviously, the grand conclusion, and I'm playing my cards right up front, is the fact that if the Gentiles are in sin and the Jews are in sin, clearly everyone's in sin. And so he will talk about that in chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, and that's where we'll pick up next week. And hang in there. We're going to get to the good news that's coming. Again, the book of Romans is a very long book. So Paul spends a lot of time in developing his thoughts here. So we're having to camp out on the bad news for a while before we get to the good news. We'll camp out there. But anyway, thanks for following me. I hope that the study has been beneficial to you. Again, if anyone has any questions, and I said this in my very first one, feel free to email me at skipster63@aol.com. That's SKIP as in Paul, ST as in Tom, ER63@aol.com. What I might do with some of the questions is not ascribe any names to them, but ask those questions for the benefit of everybody later on, again, without putting any names to it, and then answer some of your questions to the extent that I can. I'm so glad that you're following along with me in this study. I hope everybody's staying safe, and I'm really looking forward to us getting back together again. And we'll continue with the study. May even continue with it even after we are able to get back together again, if you find it to be beneficial. But thanks again. Appreciate it.